Hello, friends. Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a box I can really get excited about. It's The Legacy. Is this in front of me? Yeah, I can't even tell. The Legacy of Charles Munch. There it is. There the guy is. Charles Munch. Charles. Yeah, this guy. He was, of course, one of the great conductors of all time. There is the big Munch box on RCA from his Boston years. There is an EMI Munch box of his post-Boston and really early stuff. And there is now this box which contains all of the recordings he made for various Universal labels or labels now controlled by Universal, including primarily Decca, but also Deutsche Grammophon and some Philips. It's all kinds of interesting stuff. And it's all been gathered together in one 14-disc set by the worthy folk at Australian Eloquence, who actually know what they're doing. It's so marvelous. It really is. And we're going to go through everything as we always do, disc by disc, and talk about what's in them and what's good and what is a little bit less good. I mean, for Munch fans, Munch collectors, of course, all of it's good. For other people, of course, you want to be more selective. But let's take a look and see what's in it, and you can decide whether or not you want it. And I can tell you, of course, how good or important some of it is, especially compared to some of the other stuff you did. Most of these guys, you put out these retrospective boxes. They made some of the same repertoire many times. And so you may not want to hear the same thing by the same guy, or you may. And that's where things get interesting. So let's start at the beginning. And this is the beginning. This is a disc that contains, and these are recordings, all of these recordings are sort of, these are from the late 30s, and yeah, this is all like the 30s and early stuff, early stuff in his career. And most of them are made with the Paris Conservatory Orchestra, which is just, so much fun to listen to. Maurice Ravel, left-hand concerto with Jacqueline Blancard with the Orchestre de la Société Philharmonique de Paris. Very dim recording. You can't hear that much it's not important. It really isn't. But you do get the Widor Fantasy for piano and orchestra with Marcel Herrenschmidt. For all you Marcel Herrenschmidt fans, there you go. But the Widor Fantasy is a very rarely heard work, although it has been recorded in modern sound more recently, thank God. It's a very limited recording sonically. However, the real gem on this first disc is Haydn's Sinfonia concertante, also known as Symphony Number 105. It's a late work he wrote for London. It has parts for oboe, bassoon, violin, and cello as soloists, and then the rest of the orchestra in 3 movements. It's a masterpiece. It's late Haydn, not as well exposed as it should be. And Munch, for some reason, he had an affinity for it. It was this work, possibly this recording of this work, I'm not 100% sure, but that encouraged Martinu to write his symphony concertante to the same forces, basically. It's a great piece, and the sound is better, and it is so wonderful to hear the Paris Conservatory Orchestra in classical repertoire, because they have this tremendous pedigree. I've said it before, but just in case, this orchestra was founded in 1828 by Francois Habeneck, specifically for the purpose of playing Beethoven symphonies in France. And until the 1960s, they had an unbroken pedigree of performers, all of whom were trained in the Paris Conservatory. And I'm not saying they sounded like they sounded in Beethoven's day. I mean, obviously, things had improved in terms of instrument construction and other things, but the size, the forces, the style of playing remained that of the Paris Conservatory. So it's wonderful to hear them play this music. And so this Haydn Symphonie Concertante is an important recording, both historically and artistically. It's great. It's just great to hear the French soloists, to hear the way they play and what they sound like, and the recording's not bad either. And the last work here is the Mozart Adagio and Fugue in C minor with the Grande Symphonie Orchestra. I have no idea what that is. It's a nice little bonus. So, disc 1 for the Haydn. That's what you get it for. Disc 2 Equally desirable, Beethoven's Eighth and Mendelssohn's Reformation Symphony, both with the Paris Conservatory Orchestra. Now, these were recorded slightly later. I'm thinking, looking at this, and it's about 19... The type is so tiny you can't see. 1948, yes. 1948. And they're marvelous. I mean, they're just marvelous. The Beethoven is that slashing, exciting French-style Beethoven, which is authentic Beethoven, if you want to call it that. Very exciting performance. And the Mendelssohn is very interesting to hear from an orchestra that almost never played Mendelssohn. It's so different, especially in the Reformation symphonies, from those sort of fat, pudgy German versions that we're used to. But remember, Charles Munch was from Alsace. He was actually a Bach guy. He got his training, playing violin in the Leipzig Gewandhaus Orchestra. So he knew this music. He knew German music. I mean, we know from his Boston recordings, he made great recordings of some of that stuff. But this is an all French version, which makes it even more fun. And the Beethoven Eighth you really should hear. Next, Berlioz. Oh, yes. Now, Berlioz was a Munch specialty. These recordings were on Decca, and I just have to say straight out, they were always trashed in the English press because the sound of the Paris Conservatory Orchestra was such a different sound from the standard that English orchestras aspired to. And most of the English orchestras in the immediate post-war period, like French orchestras and German orchestras, were not in the best shape. They were recovering from losing a lot of players during the war, whichever side you were on. And they just weren't at their best. And some of them sounded better than others. The Paris Conservatory, because France capitulated nice and early to keep its cultural institutions intact. There's nothing like surrender to keep your arts business going properly. So the Paris Conservatory Orchestra wasn't in such bad shape. And Munch was a Berlioz, that was his guy. He was the Berlioz guy. And there are some really exciting performances on here. You get Benvenuto Cellini, the overture. You get 3 scenes from Romeo and Juliet. The ball at the Capulets, the love scene, and, of course, the Queen Mab scherzo. Then you get the Royal Hunt and Storm from Les Troyens. And finally, Le Corsaire, a smoking version of that overture, which was also sort of a Munch specialty. I mean, it just flies. And to hear the Paris Conservatory Orchestra play this stuff is amazing. So screw those gramophone critics, They were jealous. They were being nationalistic and provincial and trying to praise like the London Philharmonic in the 50s, which sounded like garbage, and the London Symphony in the 50s, which sounded like garbage, at the expense of the French orchestras, which sounded better. They just had a different style, but they played well within that style. This Berlioz disc proves it. It's terrific. Next, Munch actually did quite a few recordings in London, and here are some of them. We have the Schumann Fourth with the London Philharmonic. This is a fast performance. Holy cow. The scherzo, how like the scherzo is like those most German performances. It's bum, 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 bum. No. This is bum, 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 bum. It's great. Just great. You get through the whole symphony in 23 minutes and 52 seconds. What's not to love, right? And you've got room on it for the Brahms Violin Concerto with Ossi Renardi. All the Ossi Renardi fans. I mean, there's historical violin people. They do collect Ossi Renardi. It's a very good Brahms Violin Concerto, and the orchestra is the Concerto. I mean, what's not to love? Again, great. Great to hear. Great to have. And now, César Franck, the Symphony in D minor. Yay! And the symphonic variations with Eileen Joyce, who's always wonderful. I mean, she's a wonderful pianist. So this is nice to have. And then you get Saint-Saëns, Le Rouet d'Omphale, with, let's see, who's doing that? These are all Paris Conservatory. Yes, which we want to hear. Tons of. And the Danse Macabre with the Concerto, which is beautiful. Beautifully done. Now, as I said, all of these are from like the late 40s, early 50s. And so, the sound quality varies sometimes rather considerably. But aside from that first disc, all of this stuff is pretty much very listenable. It's really not bad. And some of it's really extraordinarily good. So there you go. Next, the Bizet Symphony in C with La Jolie Fille de Perth, Danse Bohémienne, and Fauré's Pélias et Mélisande and Pavane, and the dandy Ferval Prélude. Now, Ferval, in case you haven't heard it, is fake Parsifal. That's all it is. It is phony Wagner. It's ridiculous. The Fauré stuff is beautiful, and the Bizet is, of course, wonderful, and Munch recorded it a few times. You know, this is with the London Philharmonic for the most part. The Paris Conservatory Orchestra does the Fauré Pavane and the Dandy Ferval, but all the rest is with the London Philharmonic. Now, the Bizet Symphony is just fast. It's really fast and really, really breathless, and the orchestra's hanging on for dear life, and I kind of feel sorry for them. It's not Munch at his best, but the Fauré is quite lovely, and, you know, it's not terrible. Now, this one is really fun. This is fun. Prokofiev Classical Symphony and the Tchaikovsky Patik, both with the Paris Conservatory. The sound is pretty good. The performances, you know, the Prokofiev, again, it opens with this really frantic first movement that's lots of fun. But the finale, he understands that the flute part is impossible, completely impossible. So he slows it down enough so that they can attempt it. You know the part I mean? The second part, the part that goes, you know, it's doing that. Well, I don't know. I could show you the score, but, you know, who cares? If you ever look at it, that ain't one flute. That's two flutes, and they're interlocking, and it's physically unplayable, basically physically unplayable. I mean, you know, you could sort of just to coordinate, and they all fake it. All the flutists in the world fake it. They all just sort of make chirpy sounds, and it comes out sounding absolutely fine. And then the Patik. Now, Munch was something of a wild man live, you know? His studio recordings are a lot more sober. He tended to behave himself more when he was in the studio. But this Patik, which I'm sure few people will rate as one of the great Patiks, but it does give you a sense of more of what he was about in a live concert, because whoa, is he free with tempos. I mean, the march, I mean, it's fast, it's slow, it's loud, it's soft, it's all over the place. You know, the Paris Conservatory Orchestra does not have the weight and lushness that we came to expect in Tchaikovsky. It's a very French sound. But that also, by the way, is a legitimate Tchaikovsky sound, because, of course, Tchaikovsky's culture, the musical culture of Russia in those days, was French by and large. So it's perfectly legitimate. And, oh my, there is so much passion in the finale of this Patik. You know, I mean, he's not too careful with, like, observing dynamics, you know, because they're emoting so heavily. But, you know, if that's a fault, it's a fault in the right direction. Yeah? I think so. Debussy, Iberia, and the Berceuse Héroïque, along with a great Roussel collection, the Petite Suite, the Spider's Feast, Symphonic Fragments, and the Suite in F. Now, the Spider's Feast and the Suite in F are with the London Philharmonic, which Munch had playing pretty well. And actually, you got to give Adrian Bolt some credit too, because he was their conductor then, and he trained them very well. Also, he really did. I mean, they could do well when they wanted to. And the Debussy Iberia, a little cloudy sonically, not the most exciting Iberia out there, but again, you know, these historical things, you sort of pays your money and you takes your chances. Now, here's sort of a lousy sounding record. Well, except for, well, there are two exceptions. Let's just say. You get Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe Suites 1 and 2 in really, really dim sound. And I'm not quite sure. I'm looking at this. It says 47 and 53. Well, 53 is the Ravel Piano Concerto in G major with Nicole Henriot Schweitzer, who, you know, Munch worked with her in many things, including, you know, things like the Prokofiev Second Piano Concerto, and I think she did that, and she remade the Ravel G major with him in Boston. This is a wonderful Ravel G major, and it is fascinating to hear the Paris Conservatory Orchestra again play it. They did it with Taunt too, of course, with Samson Francois. But, this particular recording, for some reason, it has a pinpoint precision and transparency that's unlike any other performance I've ever heard. I mean, if you love the Ravel G major, you really need to hear this performance of it. And as a bonus, you get a fascinating bolero, really slow, almost 17 minutes, really the same tempo as Ravel's own, just about. Very, very deliberate. And you get to hear all the soloists of the Paris Conservatory Orchestra. So that's a lot of fun. And with that disc, we are done with the historical recordings, the early Munch from the immediate post-war period, the late 40s and early 50s. Then, of course, he came to Boston, and all of his stuff was on RCA, and then he left Boston, and in that immediate period, he did some things for EMI, some things for Decca, including a couple, and I'll just put them both up here, a couple of Phase 4s, which sound very Phase 4-ish, multi-mic to death, processed. The transfers here are somewhat low level. It helps to turn them up, but you get Gaieté Parisienne and the Carmen Suite, and on this one you get Respighi, the Pines of Rome, the Fountains of Rome, and the L'Arlésienne Suite by Bizet. Now, the Respighis are kind of famous because, a friend of mine listened to these and just said, "Oh my God, they're so vulgar." And that about sums them up. They are pretty vulgar. But, again, it's fun. The music can take it. The vulgar point really is the march at the end of the Pines of Rome, which is very deliberate. It's very slow, and it's just bigger and louder and noisier, and it's just fun. I just think it's fun. It's not my favorite Pines of Rome. It's not going to compete with like Reiner or Kempe or any of those Pines of Rome people, but it's great fun. And of course, Gaieté Parisienne is gay and Parisienne, and Bizet is Bizet. So there's nothing not to enjoy there. Now, this is a very interesting recording. This was originally, I think, on Vega or one of those odd labels to begin with. Yeah, it was Vega. You get the Henry Barraud Suite, Symphony Number 3, which nobody knows. Very interesting. And Roussel's Bacchus and Ariadne Suite Number 2. Very short playing time on this disc, but at least, these are the only two pieces he did on that label, so it makes sense as far as it goes. The Barraud sounds something like Roussel mating with Honegger. It's that kind of sort of angular, sometimes, sharp, gnarly, but, ultimately tonal and fun to listen to, I think. French neoclassical style. And Roussel, Bacchus and Ariadne Suite Number 2 was always a Munch specialty. These performances are with the Orchestre National de l'RTF, which is Radio and Television Français. They're not a great orchestra either, but it doesn't matter. The repertoire is interesting, and Munch's Bacchus is great. He just whips up the final bacchanal to a delicious frenzy. The actual tune kind of gets buried in the accompaniment at the end, and the horns are going da do 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 do, and everything else is sort of swirling around, and the trumpets are going like that. Well, okay, it's Munch. He gets carried away, but in a good way. And the ensemble doesn't go completely to smithereens. Now, the last two discs in this set are probably the least necessary, but for completeness sake, we have to have them. It's his Symphony Fantastique that he made with the Hungarian Radio and Television Orchestra. This first appeared on Philips. And the Deutsche Grammophon Berlioz Requiem. There we go, let's put it straight up. With the Bavarian Radio Symphony Orchestra with Peter Schreier singing the tenor solo. Now, the Symphony Fantastique, that was Munch's calling card. He recorded it twice in Boston. Then he did one for EMI, and I think there's another one somewhere. And then there's this one. This is probably the least interesting of them all. And as far as the Berlioz Requiem goes, it's very interesting. I had a very long conversation with my good friend Christophe Huss, who's up in Montreal and who at that point was still in Paris, about Berlioz Requiems with Munch, because the RCA version with Boston, which is in living stereo and sounds absolutely phenomenal and completely blows this one out of the water. It's the reference recording for the work. he didn't know it because RCA stuff was not easy to come by in parts of Europe. And of course, the Deutsche Grammophon one wasn't easy to come by in the United States. But once we were able to put them together and you weigh them on balance, the Boston one is just astonishing, and the DG is, well, let's just say it's not as good. It's the orchestra is not nearly as good. The chorus is okay. The engineering is kind of, it sounds small. You know what I mean? And there's one thing you never, ever, ever want is for the Berlioz Requiem to sound small. It's kind of the same sound they got for, the Kubelik Mahler 8 and the Gurlieder that he did. Those huge, huge works that they must have made them in a studio or something, but everything about it is just too small scale. And it's a shame. But, for Munch completists, they'll want this stuff. So on the whole, this is a great box. The Munch Legacy, the legacy of Charles Munch, on the Universal labels, a beautifully produced box from Australian Eloquence that it's a real collector's item. I mean, that's what it is. If you're not a hardcore collector or Charles Munch groupie, you don't need this. But serious collectors, and I know a lot of my viewers are serious collectors, and some people are just beginning. So if you're just beginning, it's good to know this stuff exists and know who this is, but it's not a priority if you're going to get Munch's Boston recordings, because those are the ones, they're in stereo, they sound great. That was sort of his big legacy. But he did some great, great work for Decca. And some of these historical recordings with the Paris Conservatory Orchestra are they're wonderful. It's wonderful for the orchestra and for what it tells us about the French style of performance, as for the fact that Munch is conducting them. So they're terrific to have. And, thank you to Australian Eloquence for another job extremely well done. So keep on listening, folks, and enjoy the Charles Munch legacy on Australian Eloquence, Decca Eloquence, I suppose we should call it. Take care.